And so I found it necessary to have a little bit more work-life balance, find hobbies that aren't just statistics. And believe it or not, I did consider this rent stabilization working group to be a hobby of mine.
Kim, this is sick, sad hobby that you have.
It was not as fun as redistricting. I will say redistricting was more fun, in my opinion.
Redistricting was fun. We got a whole other episode to do on your redistricting experience, I guess.
I would love to talk about
the redistricting work group?
I think
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
This is the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. In today's episode, it's another one about rent control. You may have heard my episode with Jennifer Arnold of Inquilinos Unidos, and I recommend people go back to that for the basics. My guest today is Jonathan Kim, who was a member of the city's rent stabilization work group. Welcome to the episode, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me, John.
I don't want to do the basics. As I said, I want to hit some key points, and hopefully we can make this a quick episode for people, because I don't think people want a series of hour-long episodes on rent control. Or maybe we talk about who you are. What is your housing situation? What is your interest in this issue? Why would you volunteer to devote an extreme amount of your time to serving on this work group? Tell us about you.
Yeah, certainly. So I am a fifth-year graduate student at the University of Minnesota. I'm working on a PhD in biostatistics, which is basically just statistics applied to medical or public health data. And I'm a renter. I served on the working group as a renter. And my interest was partially personal. My bachelor's degree is in economics, so I'm always had kind of an interest in economic policy, even though I did not choose to pursue a career in economics. And then, I also have a passion for local government type stuff. I served on the city's redistricting group and really enjoyed that. And so it was time for me to choose another city group to serve on.
So I don't do enough research on my guests. And, it's good when you end up with exactly the right person. I didn't know the whole economics thing.
Oh yeah.
And you voted with the majority for the stronger policy, the 3%, and we'll get into a little more of the details. Why did you like that policy over the other one?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, if I came into this group not really having a super strong opinion on rent stabilization. I do think that my economics background, rent control / rent stabilization is kind of used as like a canonical textbook example of like regulatory policies that don't work, is typically how it's framed in most economics classes, at least Econ 101. And usually they'll draw, the crisscross supply and demand curves, and rent control is usually used as an example of what's known as a price ceiling. So can't charge above a certain level, and usually it's portrayed as, this means that the market can't achieve equilibrium and there are going to be shortages and all that. So that's typically how it's presented, but there's usually not a very nuanced presentation about what policy actually looks like. Like I said, even framing it as a price control or a price ceiling is not completely accurate, because you're implying that there's like a maximum price that you can't charge above. And especially when we talk about rent stabilization versus rent control, some people argue that's not a meaningful distinction. The Cure report, which I believe was referenced in the previous episode, was a report commissioned, I believe, by the city council, talks about how rent control usually refers to kind of the first generation of policies that was passed kind of in the wake of like World War II, And typically those are the more classical example of like price controls. And then rent stabilization is more referring to kind of a second generation of policies that became more popular like in the 70s. And that was more where you're capping, you're still allowing price increases over time, but you're capping the maximum increase.
Oh, am I learning something right now, Jonathan? I use them interchangeably. I'm one of the people who uses them interchangeably. And I don't know that I realized rent control was like, you can't go over this amount at all. No increases at all. Ever.
Something like that. I mean, that's sometimes also referred to as like a price freeze. But yeah, I think at least if my reading of the Cura report, if my recollection of it is accurate, I believe that's more or less how it was framed.
Okay, I will not push you further out onto this limb when we make mistakes.
To be fair, I think some news publications, like the Star Tribune, I think mentioned that they use them interchangeably because I guess not all economists. I don't think it's a standardized distinction, but it's a distinction that the Cura report makes, and that was kind of a major source for our research. That's where a lot of my understanding comes from. So
you, with your economics degree, what won you over? Because I have to admit, I have been more skeptical of rent control in the past, and I still am worried that we could get it wrong. Mm-hmm. But from your perspective, do you feel like you got won over? Like what was the process of winning you over to thinking this is the right approach?
Yeah, so I guess kind of going back to like what I was talking about, how it's rent control is often portrayed in kind of intro Econ 101 courses. That very basic model of, intersecting supply and demand curves. I think it's just that it's a model used to try to show how market dynamics work. And we have a saying in the statistics community, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And essentially the idea is that, when you make a model, you have to make simplifying assumptions. And those assumptions don't always line up with reality, but depending on the context in which you're using it, it might be useful. And so I do think kind of those fairly simplistic supply and demand curve models can be useful for illustrating broad dynamics to a classroom of undergraduates, for example. But when it comes to dealing with something as complex and dynamic as like a housing market, I think I'm more interested in looking at more specific kind of empirical research on what has actually happened in places where it's actually been done. And so I would say one of the things that at least won me over to being open to some sort of rent stabilization policy is that the literature, at least that I've read on a lot of this, is research that was provided to us on the working group. It seems more mixed than it is conclusively like bad. I think some people will say, economists broadly agree that rent stabilization is bad. I think there was a Star Tribune like op-ed that said that, but they didn't actually, there's no citation exactly. And I think, when you start looking at specific, more complex, nuanced policies of rent stabilization, I do think that the literature is not quite as clear. And several studies that were provided to us suggest that there are potential benefits. And so I would say that from that starting point, I was certainly more open-minded to voting for a relatively stronger policy.
There's so many moving pieces.
Mm-hmm.
There's no like one rent control policy.
Exactly.
And so
yeah.
there are different increase thresholds, 3% or more, different jurisdictions. I don't know if any two rent control policies are exactly alike. And so one of the things I'm concerned about, Jonathan, maybe you can answer this. I think I know this to be true, but do most or all rent control policies exempt new construction? Am I accurate on that?
I believe that question was asked to Ed Getz, I believe is his name. He was, I believe, the primary author of the Cura study, works for the University of Minnesota. He did a Q&A for us on both the report and his research and rent regulation more broadly. And I believe someone asked him that very question. And I believe his response was the only policy that he and his research team were aware of that did not exempt new construction in the United States was St. Paul's, which has now since been undone, I believe.
So I am concerned potentially that the policy as recommended that doesn't exempt new construction will hinder new development. And I know a lot of people have suggested that's exactly what happened in St. Paul. I don't know that enough time has passed necessarily. It's hard to judge in one place over a short period of time right after it happens. But that's something I'm worried about. Is that something you're worried about?
The short answer is yes, I am. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, I think. As you say, no two policies are alike. There's a lot of moving parts. Obviously, as a statistics person, I like data, but it's also important to recognize the limitations of the data that we have. There aren't a ton of cities in the United States that have tried rent stabilization, and so I don't think we really have a clear idea of exactly how things are going to pan out. I think we can have some reasonable idea, but anyway, going back to your original question, am I concerned? Yes, I am, but ultimately I chose to vote for the stronger policy over the other policy, which I hesitate to look at that other framework, I guess we could say, that was presented, the minority report, I think, as you referred to it on your last episode, the one that got 11 votes on the working group. It's hard for me to see that as really a rent stabilization policy. It seems much closer to like an anti-rent gouging policy, just in terms of the large number of exemptions that it allows, 5 to 7% rent cap plus CPI.
Right.
So yeah, I think
the numbers on that, the increases would be so high, I'm not even sure it qualifies as anti-rent gouging necessarily. Those would be some very, I know I never had increases like that. I was never subjected to increases like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think I certainly came into this working group fully aware of the fact that, city council, at least to my knowledge, never made a pledge to abide by the recommendations of the working group. And as we've seen, Mayor Fry has already come out against the recommendations, or saying that he will veto. So I was fully aware that it was very likely that there would be changes based on what we recommended, but I guess I would say I would prefer that the starting point for the conversation be the stronger policy over the much weaker policy.
Did he ever specify exactly what his objection was? I know the 3% gets the headlines, but I don't know that 3% is should be the sticking point. 3% plus or minus a percent seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, I would say, especially based on the Cure report, I know the Cure report has been misrepresented by a lot of people. I mean, I do understand that it's a very long, and some people, I think it's exciting, but I'm not normal.
I only viewed the slides. That's how you get around reading in a long report. You just view the slides.
Yeah. So the report, despite what people say, the report does not make any specific policy recommendations, or if it does, right. I couldn't find them. But they did, I believe, a simulation of kind of how different percent caps would affect the market, and it did not seem like a 3% cap would have particularly strong.
If you view the slides, you can see they charted actual increases over 2 decades, and then they had another line which was if X policy had been enacted, and typically even the 3% line was below or was above what history shows us typical rent increases have been. So
I guess going back to your original question, I'm not subscribed to the Star Tribune, so that was the only article that I saw trending about his comments. So I don't know if it goes into more detail. I could not find a more specific set of objections or anything like that. So yeah,
one of the benefits of being Mayor Fry is you get to say no. And you don't have to say what your idea is, because as soon as you have your own ideas and people start taking shots at you, it's one of the great advantages Mayor Fry has had, is not having to have his own ideas, just take pot shots at other people's ideas. So you signed on to the 3% with no exemptions, that whole list, that more strict version. were there things you were questionable on, but you're like, I'm going to sign on to this anyway? Maybe the lack of a exemption for new construction qualifies as that. I don't know. But are there things where you're like, I would have tweaked this a little bit, but it was good enough for me. I'm signing on to this one and not the other.
Yeah, I would say the biggest concern that I had was actually about enforcement and compliance. I think that from the beginning was the thing that I think seemed the least contentious. A lot of people seem to already have made up their minds about percent caps and like various core policy components and what should or shouldn't be exempt. But I never really saw like hard battle lines being drawn in terms of how it should be enforced, or at the very least that didn't seem to be generating a lot of like, various Twitter threads I've seen of people having discussions about it. That the enforcement mechanism never seemed to be something that caught a lot of people's attention. And so I was hoping that we would get that could be the part where when I started on the working group, I was hoping that we would devote more time to really exploring the different enforcement mechanisms. And I guess I would say that my primary concern was I wanted to see a really well-enforced policy, even if it was maybe not as strong as I would like, for example, because I think if you have a really strong policy that's poorly enforced, that's not really going to do much of anything.
So what is the way to enforce it? As I was channeling Lisa Goodman on the previous episode, because I can hear her voice saying, we can't do this. This is going to be really expensive, lots of staff time that we don't have. So what do you think the city should do?
Well, and I wish this was one of the parts that I think was very difficult about what we were tasked to do and the resources that we were given is I feel like the discussion was primarily based on like self-monitoring enforcement, basically like having a self-certification process for landlords to self-certify, am I exempt from rent stabilization or not? Exactly what that would entail was never made clear to us. But it was, this kind of, and then having enforcement be incumbent on tenants to have to file a complaint, basically, if there was ever any non-compliance. And then it was basically that, which I think is more or less what the weaker framework calls for, that set of monitoring enforcement versus a more active form of monitoring and compliance, which is done by the city, which could either be an independent board or done within some city department.
Asking for weaker enforcement just seems like because there were some landlords, property owners on the work group, and asking for weaker enforcement just means you get away with more. That's why you would advocate for that, I think. I don't know why else you would ask for weaker enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, the main argument that I think was presented was that it would be a cost saver. Can the city afford to staff and supply a board to monitor compliance? But I mean, I don't know. I think, like I said, we weren't given any sort of fiscal projections about how much would this cost, how much would different alternatives cost. So we weren't really able to get into that.
I mean, we staff a property tax or property value appeals board for homeowners, so they can go to a place and say, my value is too high, my taxes as a result are too high, so I don't know, 50+% of the city are renters. Maybe we could have a board for that too, for those costs. Do you have a sense of how many people on the work group were there because they wanted a policy? Like maybe they didn't agree with a stronger form, but they agreed that the policy was necessary and they wanted to get it right, versus just trying to get in the way of the more aggressive policy?
Yeah, I think it was pretty clear that, this whole working group was, I guess you could say the central conceit of this working group was that we were all open-minded, indifferent people who were all going to come to the table. We were going to collaborate. We were going to have discussions, and then we were going to come to some consensus where we were all going to hold hands around a campfire and sing songs and talk about, present this one unified framework.
Jonathan, I believe the language was good faith. I don't think they mentioned a campfire. You're exaggerating.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. There was no campfire in the enabling resolution. But yeah, I think, and that just was immediately obvious that that was not the case. I mean, just looking at it, it felt a lot similar to the kind of song and dance routine that people play with the Supreme Court. Some who still try to pretend like they are indifferent, impartial arbiters. They're just trying to interpret the Constitution, that completely ignores the blatantly partisan forces that affect who gets nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court. And, you know, it was pretty clear looking at, I mean, I actually watched the city council meeting where they passed this enabling resolution and the negotiations that were going on as to which organizations get what seats and how many of this, how many of that. I mean, it was pretty clear that, again, you know, we were appointed, the seats were allocated based on certain individuals being assumed to have a certain mindset or another. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem, but I think it is a problem if you try to pretend that that's not the case when it is.
Right. So I watched that meeting too, and it was basically like council member Jeremiah Ellison would be, I want to have this renter advocacy group on the panel. And Lisa Goodman was like, oh, you want that? Well, now I want the landlord lobby. I want MHA on there. I want the realtors. You get one and I get one. And I don't know, as you sort of hint there, I don't know that that's necessarily productive when you've got, and I was skeptical that they would reach a stronger recommendation, because I figured, well, the council is more conservative than the last one. They're kind of aligned with Jacob Fry, who obviously doesn't like the policy. I just assumed that the game was rigged towards doing something about where the council is politically. And it turns out that I think this recommendation is to the left of where the council is politically. So that's a little bit surprising to me that this work group had membership that is going to tug the council a little bit to the left, I think.
Yeah, I think it was, I think a lot of people, myself included, were frustrated by various aspects of the process. So I know this was mentioned in the last episode, but, you know, with 25 people on the working group, we were broken up into 5 groups of 5 throughout the entirety of the process. I've used the phrase we were siloed into groups of 5. And I understand that, you know, it is hard trying to wrangle 25 people. I think we had a difficult time wrangling 24 people on the redistricting group. You know, that's a lot of people. But so I don't blame the fact that we started out in groups of 5, but throughout the entire process, we almost never got to interact with people outside of those groups. And so, and those groups seem to be kind of intentionally chosen to have a balance of perspectives. So like a couple people from like landlords and developer organizations, a couple renters or tenant advocates. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but then, you know, when there's no interaction with people outside of your group, there's a lot of perspectives that I just didn't get a chance to really learn from. And I think, you know, looking through the meeting notes, they didn't always break down the various perspectives, who said what in each group, you know, so I didn't always know what perspective I was reading, looking at other groups' notes. So yeah, that was definitely a limitation of the process. You know, the use of a third-party facilitator, Neo Partners, I believe it was. I want to be charitable to them. I think every individual I interacted with from that group was very polite, professional. I think they were trying their best, but it seemed pretty clear to me that it did not seem like they were, it seemed like they were a consulting group, that they're not particularly, the individuals did not seem to have a lot of expertise in like this type of like rental policy work. And
Right.
So there would be several times where we would be having like a group discussion, and we would be having like a conversation, and then the person taking notes would basically say, okay, I have to fill in these boxes. How do I put what you just said into these boxes? And it was like, well, these boxes don't seem to have been designed by, it seemed to have been designed by kind of a, like I said, a consulting group that just kind of applies a similar process to a lot of different clients, and not necessarily one that was tailored for this very specific process.
Which which occurs to me could be a good thing, because if you're bringing in a consulting group that is like specializes in rent control policy, I could imagine a lot of accusations like, well, see, this group has gone around to these cities recommending this policy, which I don't like, therefore they're biased. So
That's a
seems
fair...
probably good that they can just like take what you're giving them and not kind of warp it through their own expertise. Not that I don't like experts, but
I mean, that's a fair point, but I guess what I was building up to, one of the biggest limitations was when it came time for them to create the various frameworks for us to vote on. So listeners might know that we've been referring to the two frameworks, the really strong rent stabilization policy and the really weak one, as frameworks 5 and 7. So that implies that there were obviously more. And yes, in fact, there were 10 frameworks that we kind of voted on that kind of got tailored down to those two. But the problem with those 10 frameworks is that those were constructed by basically giving everyone on the working group a list of all the different itemized components of a rent stabilization, all the core policy provisions, all of the monitoring compliance, all the exemptions. And we basically put a check next to the ones we liked. And then they looked at kind of all the various responses and compiled sample frameworks based on that. But the problem with doing that is that several of the frameworks didn't really seem coherent. They were pairing policies that didn't necessarily seem to go together very well. And so when it came time to actually vote, we had 10 options, but not all 10 options were what I would consider viable options.
Right.
Because like I said, they seem to have been constructed in this very like disjoint manner. There wasn't as much thought of how the different components interact. And there also weren't a lot of options for us to check in the first place. For example, I think y'all had a discussion about like CPI to adjust for inflation and how that's may not be the best measure to adjust for housing costs, and potentially considering other metrics, but then other metrics weren't really discussed. And so we never had the option to say, I want a variable policy, just not CPI. That wasn't really an option. It was, you either want a fixed cap or you want CPI. Those were kind of the only two things you can vote on. And that's just an example. There were other policies where I think there were a lot of different ways you could have supported one thing or the other thing, but we didn't have the option to express that in how we voted.
These are all valid criticisms, Jonathan, but I feel like I'm shocked that you ended up putting all those people in a room, that you ended up with any recommendations at all. So they did something right to extract a recommendation from this group with a lot of diverging opinions.
Yeah. And again, like I said, I want to be charitable to them. And you're right. I think the fact that we had anything at all is probably something to be happy with. I mean, maybe you can chalk this up to my youth and inexperience. I'm still relatively new to all of this sort of thing. So maybe... You
want things to make sense.
I do.
Too much an orderly mind. Sometimes you have to throw everything at the wall and see what shakes out. Throw 10 things at the wall. A lot of them don't make sense, and maybe you come up with something. You know what I learned talking to, or maybe not learned, but I came to a greater understanding talking with Jennifer Arnold, was the interaction between vacancy control, which is a phrase you hear for many years just being kind of adjacent to rent control policy discussions. And your eyes kind of glaze over and you don't know what it means. But like the importance of pairing vacancy decontrol, if that's the way you're going, with just cause eviction. If you don't have just cause eviction protections for renters, going the vacancy decontrol route just makes your rent control policy meaningless, because landlords will force tenants out, because as soon as the tenant's out, no more rent control. I can set my rents whatever I want them to be. So I think it's a really important key thing for people to keep in mind is vacancy control is necessary unless you have pretty strong just cause eviction protections. Did you want to speak to that, or are there any things like that where through this process you kind of think this is really important? I don't know. I think people are over focusing on the 3% and not these other things.
Yeah. Like I said, as I mentioned before, I do think that however, whatever comes out of this, whatever the city council ends up putting forward to the ballot, I do hope people pay more attention to, like I said, monitoring and compliance. And whatever that is, I do think that is a key part of the policy that's easy to overlook. Yeah, I would also agree with that. I think just cause evictions, I mean, that was something that was mentioned a lot. That seemed to have more broad support than other policy ideas. It seemed like even people who were more skeptical of rent stabilization supported the idea of just cause eviction protections. But that also didn't get a ton of discussion. I feel like it was, and maybe it was complicated. I know in your episode, I learned this from listening to that episode about how, I guess, a judge has halted or thrown out St. Paul's attempt at just cause eviction protections. So maybe that complicated things. I don't know.
And St. Paul, one of the changes they made to the rent control policy, one of the things I learned from Jennifer Arnold is the prohibition on rent control statewide, unless you enact it on the ballot, is that you also can't have just cause eviction protections. I guess that was the judge's reasoning. And so
I think I had read at one point the state statute on that. And I think, if my memory serves correctly, the statute is written saying that regulations on rents is preempted unless you have the consent of the governed, people
Right.
voting on it basically. And so maybe just cause evictions, I wasn't specifically named, but maybe the judge's reasoning was that also counts as regulation on rents. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I can't tell you.
It has since become the case that St. Paul has just cause eviction protections in their new partial vacancy decontrol policy, which people can go look up on St. Paul's city website. Well, Jonathan, I think we're coming to the end. Have I forgotten anything at all? Because I wanted to keep this short, but
yes, well, I certainly did have criticisms of how I would have liked the process to have gone. It was a good experience overall, and I couldn't tell you what's going to come next. That's in the hands of our city council and our mayor, but and then ultimately the voters in November. Hopefully, I hope we get the chance to vote on something.
Are you going to run for office or something? Why are you getting yourself appointed to so many work groups? What is the bigger plan here for Jonathan Kim?
I don't think I have it in me to hold elected office. The thought of campaigning makes me sick.
Me too.
But no, grad school is a very isolating experience, at least for me. Doing statistics and nothing but statistics makes me stop loving statistics. And so I found it necessary to have a little bit more work-life balance, find hobbies that aren't just statistics. And believe it or not, I did consider this rent stabilization working group to be a hobby of mine.
Kim, this is sick, sad hobby that you have.
It was not as fun as redistricting, I will say. Redistricting was more fun, in my opinion.
Redistricting was fun. We got a whole other episode to do on your redistricting experience, I guess.
I would love to talk
about the
about it.
redistricting work group?
I think it was just, it was so obscure and so specific. I felt like I got to understand, I had a better understanding of that than rent stabilization, which I feel like there's just, like I said, a lot more uncertainty around. But I love obscure technical things that other people find boring. And I think as long as I have believe it or not, I do have time for this sort of thing despite being a grad student. And so I figure as long as I have time and energy for that sort of thing, I want to serve my city.
The most memorable thing about the redistricting work group for me was when they cut out the Aldi. There was an Aldi in Ward 4 because one of the members of the work group was like, no, the people who live around this park, this is a community. You cannot break them up. They need to be together. And like the thing that got changed was an Aldi because apparently looking at a map, you don't know what buildings or businesses exist on these things. And so she thought it was really important that the Aldi was kept together with the other residents around this one park in North Minneapolis, which I thought was hilarious.
I remember that very specific ordeal.
I don't know what happened to the Aldi. Was the Aldi eventually split off?
No, that the Ward 4 and 5 boundaries were restored to what they had been for the previous 10 years.
Okay, so Aldi is still off by itself?
It's
ward?
wherever it was previously.
Okay. Do you have any, what's your most memorable thing from the redistricting work group?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think the thing that I thought was the most funny about it, well, funny and a little, I guess, unsettling, was the Cedar-Isles-Dean Neighborhood Association making a very last minute push to try to change the park board map, because I guess one of their main objections was that they were being separated from their namesake lakes or something to that effect. I think it was mostly that they were actually moving they had been in Park District 4, I think they were being moved to Park District 6. But yeah, one of the reasonings they gave for why that was bad was that, Cedar Lake and Lake of the Isles would no longer be in their same district. And that was...
Didn't Commissioner Forney try to pull a fast one with that? I don't remember the details exactly, but...
Park Board president, I don't know if she's still Park Board president, Forney did appear to testify, as did I can't remember his name, the attorney for the Park Board.
Brian Rice.
Yeah, but I think they were, officially speaking in their capacity as private citizens. Yeah, and they were speaking at the Charter Commission meeting that was officially adopting it. Very last minute push. That seemed weird. And I think the thing that made it memorable for me was that I was the one who had proposed the move in the first place. So I kept him. I'm just waiting for Cedar-Isles-Dean Neighborhood Association to name me public enemy number 1.
Yeah, right after opposing bike lanes on Hennepin Avenue, Jonathan Kim is public enemy number 1 for Cedar-Isles-Dean, I think. Okay. Jonathan, this has been a pleasure to meet you and talk about rent stabilization and a little bit of redistricting. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be on a podcast that I listen to a lot.
Oh, well, it's an honor to have you as a listener. Look at us. We love each other here.
Yes.
This has been the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. Thank you to Jonathan Kim, and thank you to all of you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.